Thanks, Ava. Really appreciate being here. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy days. I know how chaotic those operational days are. So I really do appreciate you joining us today. So today we're really going to be talking about an interesting area. So it's so often that we have these issues, we have these challenges, and what we do is we're technologists. So we like throwing technology at solutions. It just kind of seems to be a natural fit. But a lot of times and most of the time we can often actually move forward by subtracting. We can simplify our environments. We can just clarify things. And core to that is, how and why, right? That plays into the strategy piece. So that's going to be sort of our theme today. I'm going to spend a few minutes just kind of going through some data points because, of course, we're Forrester. We really pride ourselves on a lot of our data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few data points first. I'm going to go through that fairly quickly because I don't want to bore you all, especially if you're in the morning, you haven't had enough coffee. You're going to be falling asleep on us, which is not a good thing. And then we're going to move into actually what I'm really looking forward to more so is an open conversation with Ian around strategy, around a few different areas, 5, 6 different areas that we want to touch on that really help move you forward in your observability journey, how you implement it, what you need to think about, and that sort of thing. So we'll get started. So on some of these data points, we'll start with business objectives. And what you're seeing here is a pattern that we've seen in a lot of different organizations, different industries, and it's the investments, right? So where are organizations going? What are their priorities in terms of their business objectives? And you see the pattern here with these three: the ability to innovate, operational resilience, accelerating time to market. What we're talking about is adaptivity, nimbleness. I try not to use the term agile so we don't get confused in terms of agile from a technical perspective, but the business needs to be more nimble and able to move. And the way you do that is investing in some of these business objectives so that you can move. You being the IT organization, a high-performing IT organization, has to have that adaptivity, has to be able to move when the market changes. We think about the pandemic, we think about other major issues that arise in our industries or around the world, and your business leaders come down to you and they say, hey, we need to go. We need to turn left here. We need to change our strategy. We need to change our objective. And the only way we do that is with a solid strategy that enables resilience, that's that stability, that enablement. It enables us to innovate and look at emerging technologies and really move forward. So it's really kind of key in where we're putting the priorities. Our business wants us to put our priorities. We can't have any conversation these days without talking about cost. I'm not going to belabor this point, but what I want to kind of get across here is cost is industry-based, it's team-based, it's technology-based. If you look at this this graphic, this slide here, 4 different points. These are 4 different studies that we've performed. 2 on the right are more the priorities and future fit. So they're broader, they're not really focused on any one particular organization, one particular industry, or anything like that. The 2 on the left are more focused. They're on infrastructure, hardware. They're focused on the network and telecom. So the pattern there is that cost is always an issue, whether that's getting more value out of it, whether that's smart investment, strategic investment, so that, hey, when something comes up and when my business partners come to me, I'm ready to go, or cost containment and cost management. Hey, we're just spending way too much on this and we're not getting the value out of it. We're not realizing the benefits out of this. So, let's kind of look at that. So cost is a broad term, and it does apply at all these levels, both vertically, horizontally, and across the board. So this slide, from a Forrester perspective, we've actually moved on to slightly different terminology, but this slide was still applicable. We've moved into a broader conversation around high performance IT. We just found, and you can see from here in future fit, that bottom block there, it's only 6% of the organizations that we, in our study and our research, we're finding that are truly adaptive and they're creative and they have all that resilience in place. So we've changed our terminology to be more around high performance IT, because your organization is constantly going through changes. It's squeezing out a little bit more here to amplify certain capabilities. It's working with partners to co-create other services and functions or products. And it's leveraging emerging technology. The point here is you don't do that in a vacuum, and you don't. That's not a tactical decision. It's very strategic in nature. That's how you move forward. And in order to do a lot of that is you have to see what's going on in your organization. That's where observability really plays in. Like, can you see what's going on with the systems? Are you getting the benefits out of those systems that your business partners expected? Are your business partners seeing what's going on in their systems? Are they is the sales funnel working the way it's supposed to? Are they getting the results from that new marketing campaign that they wanted to? So all of this has to play into how you put your technology in place. And again, just throwing some more technology at it isn't necessarily going to drive better insights. It's just going to provide a lot more data, maybe good, maybe not, but it definitely will provide a lot more noise that you have to sort through. So going a little deeper into this research, you look at these two main pieces that I pulled out, right? One of them is articulating your digital strategy. Communication is still foundational and key to any success. And you can see how the future fit organizations are really in agreement on that, whereas the traditional organizations just not quite there. They haven't matured to that level. And the other piece is measuring outcomes. There's no way you can really move forward if you're not measuring what did we do? Did we get the results? Did we not? How do we adjust? How do we tack left, right, or whatever to make sure that you're doing that? So you're not going to get there if you don't measure those outcomes, match those back to what was working, what wasn't working, do experiments, work through some of those things and say, okay, hey, I think we can scale this. This worked, but it's not scalable. How can we change it? So you want to really kind of play into that. And again, a lot of these things, they're tactical when you get to the end of it, but the broader approach to this is a very strategic approach that, from a leadership perspective, especially, you really have to think through. Again, back on priorities, customer-facing technologies. The one I want to kind of highlight here, while all of them are, kind of telling a good story, is again consolidating the overall number of solutions. If you have more solutions already there, and in most organizations, and Ian and I are going to touch on this a little later, but if you have too many tools in place, think about the cost of that, not just in the licensing, but in the training. You think about the swivel seat type issues. Think about the delays that play into having all these different tools, and it's just a big issue across the board from an operational perspective. And talking about handling these issues, when you think of mean time to repair, mean time to resolve, however you want to do that. But even in terms of mean time to identification and that sort of thing, you need the observability. You need to be able to see what's going on in its full state across the stack, or up and down the stack, I should say, and really understand what impacted what. What were the inflection points? What may have caused this microservice to fail? When you start taking the analytics, have we seen this before? Have we maybe always been on the threshold of some of these failing? So do you have that vision and that insight into those systems? And in order to reduce that mean time to repair, which is ultimately translated in business outcomes, or positive business outcomes, negative if you're not doing it, that's really where you really need to improve your observability. And last but not least, in terms of data points, open source, open telemetry. 18 months ago, 24 months ago, I really wasn't positive. I didn't really feel comfortable that OTel was going to stick. Obviously, we've moved forward. We're seeing huge adoption rates, enterprise and vendor. And when you look at how it's being used across enterprises, internal cloud development, it's working for the container strategies. It's working, from a language perspective, all the way up through just building out insights and moving forward. So, open source is a key component. I hear enterprises all the time looking at like, hey, we're adopting open telemetry. We're moving in that direction. We want to reduce some of our costs. Obviously, that comes with some training. It comes with certain risk and stuff, but but it is a pattern that we are seeing quite a bit of. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Ian for a few minutes, and then I will be back with you and we'll have our discussion. Ian?
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, so as Carlos has illustrated, there are so many different factors of things from an engineering leadership or even business leadership perspective for the industry as technology businesses. And observability plays a really key part, both in terms of the costs, whether you're running your own observability infrastructure or you're paying a vendor, but then also the soft costs, the people that you have to use to operate these tools and maintain them. Then also the returns you're expecting. You're expecting that you're going to be able to resolve incidents so that you can meet your customer expectations. You're supposed to be able to deliver better paths to innovation for your engineering teams. And so a lot of what I've seen over the last 10 years in working in this space is an approach which is really just, hey, I'm going to go buy more tools. I'm going to go deploy more things. And an observability strategy becomes really critical as you scale up an organization, as things become more complex, if you have to balance all these different factors, economic, quality of life for your engineers, as well as customer expectations. And so being very deliberate about that and understanding I can't just go and pick another tool that's going to miraculously solve everything as a silver bullet really requires that strategic approach. And so in working with many organizations over the last few years, this is what I've come to arrive at as a starting point in having conversations about an observability strategy with them. And so at the core of it, you want to be able to develop a plan that aligns your business and engineering goals. As Carlos said, you need to be able to understand your desired outcomes. You need to understand the people who are going to be working on these things, the work that's required to be done, as well as a realistic timeline. Time and time again, I see observability initiatives that are simply, hey, we're going to move from one tool to another. I'm going to have a very short period of time to swap over. I don't know who's going to be doing the work. And realistically, I don't know how this is going to impact my business. But it's not just about delivering a project. It's also requires you to be able to measure and adapt this over time to make sure that the outcomes that you're driving towards as they run into roadblocks, as you run into hiccups, as new technologies come along, you incorporate and adapt those into the execution of your observability strategy. And this is not something that can be taken on by just individual engineers who may previously have done an online trial of a tool and said, okay, this logging tool, I think it has a cool query language. This is how we're going to go and pivot what is a really key dependency in the organization. And from a stakeholder perspective, this for organizations that are successful with just observability in general, the strategy is underpinned by engagement across the business. So you might even have the CFO involved because cost is a really key aspect. You're obviously going to have engineering leadership, but then understanding all the way through the strata of the organization. Unfortunately, for example, when you think about the required teams of individuals, too often the decisions and input are from those people who think about observability day in, day out in terms of operating and maintaining it. If instead you think about, well, from a ratio perspective, I have 1,000 engineers that don't think about observability day in, day out, but have to use it when the time comes, versus all those engineers or SREs who think about observability day in, day out. That is a really large portion of your organization that oftentimes doesn't have a realistic voice in the conversation.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Go ahead.
Hey, Ian, yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that because that's such a key point in terms of the folks that are using this every day versus the one that has to kind of go in there when an incident arises on Monday, and then maybe it's Thursday again, and then maybe it's a week and a half. The number of tools that are in use plays a direct role in my opinion, to their success, right? Because if I'm not going into these tools every day, it's that much more difficult. It's going to take me time to just figure out, oh, am I going into the blue tool or the green tool or the yellow tool? Oh, actually, I have to go into the red one first, and then and if I'm not in there day in, day out, that's a huge issue, at least how I see it, versus that person that is in all of them all the time. They have them splattered across their 42-inch screen, right? And they're just kind of, like a puppet master there, right? But I mean, I see that with your enterprises that I've been talking to. Yeah, I presume you see that when you're in the field with with these organizations. You just the amount of tools that are there. How many do you normally see? I don't want to tip my hat on like some of them that I've heard, but I mean, it's more than two.
Yes.
you know?
Yeah, and I mean, it definitely depends on how you define an observability tool. But there can be, realistically, I think every organization that is trying to solve these problems has at least 8 to 10. And that doesn't even take into account those larger organizations that have things like really discrete business units, right? Where it's like you have individual technology choices being made in an uncentralized fashion. And of course, you think about your multi-business unit enterprises, and those things can spiral into the dozens and dozens.
Yeah, like I've seen as many as 50 and 60.
Yes.
And it's interesting you note the different divisions or lines of business. Sometimes the unique number of tools might only be 20 or 30, but the installed instances might be 60 or 70. Because I've
Yeah.
seen it where three different divisions have the same tool, not under the same license, but just totally isolated from each other. They're not sharing data, even though some of the back end is sharing the same information. So you think about from a management perspective, right? You have a back end that two or three different lines of business are leveraging, but they have three different tools. That means you may have different agents or the same agent there three times. It's chaos. It really is. And think about it, like, how do you bring your engineers up to speed on all these different tools?
Yeah.
What do you do with that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And one of the things that I think really underpins an observability strategy is you cannot just think about technology or product. Everyone likes, a nice little mnemonic. So I talk often about, particularly as a vendor, we think a lot about product, but people and process as the other two Ps. And we've talked a little bit about people, but if you think about the great point you made about the separated installs. So let's take, for example, I might have an on-premise logging solution, but I have 4 different installs of that. I think a great way to think about it is not I have 4 different installs of logging, but think about the number of information silos you have.
Yep.
And then you go and say, okay, well, I have 4 logging silos over here, but how many metric silos do I have? How many tracing silos? And then you start getting into the problem of, from a people perspective, how many of your engineers realistically know which problems they can solve with each of the data types.
Yeah.
And so this gets back to obviously tool consolidation and the number of tools. And of course, from a strategic perspective, you have to go deeper. So the proclivity of a lot of organizations go, I want a platform. I want to buy a whole bunch of collection of tools that are supposedly tied together. I'm going to send all my data to one place. And lots of people talk about the single pane of glass concept. But
I hate that term, but that's just
right?
me.
Absolutely. My skin crawled as I said it. But if you put all the data in one place, are you getting the outcomes, right? We talked about observability strategy, talking about outcomes like, oh, I have a single bill, but am I strategically thinking about, is that platform meet my engineers where they are? Does it help break down those information silos? Or do they just have one central SSO login, but they still have 15 different silos of information, and they still can't understand, well, if this type of customer reports this type of problem, where do I go look at? Do I have to go look at one silo or 5 different silos? And so that people and process component is really crucial. And this is where, as I mentioned before, you have to think about it not just in the perspective of, let's say, the CFO. CFO is like, it's great. I have one single invoice. It's great for my team. I got a great discount from this vendor. It's great for the business. But are you getting the MTTR outcomes? Are you getting the impact on developer burnout? Particularly in today's world where there's a high degree of mobility with remote work, having a large section of your engineers burn out and decide to move somewhere else for a better quality of life is going to be massively detrimental to your engineering velocity, which obviously drives, as you mentioned, a top business priority, which is what is our time to market? How can we deliver faster for our customers?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I want to pull a couple of those things together. You talked about the different installs and the different data pipelines they're creating. One thing that we can pretty much be guaranteed of, especially with organizations that aren't really strategic in nature, they're not instrumented the same way. So what they're bringing out, the frequency, the period, that sort of thing is going to be different. So if I look at the blue instrumentation tool, and there's 4 different ones. Well, I'm sorry, the blue observability tool instrumented 4 different ways. When I receive data, speaking to MTTR, we have an incident now, and like, oh, I need data from the blue tool. It's like, well, which version of it? And I maybe don't even know because it came from the blue tool, but was that instrumented A, instrumented B, instrumented, and the odds of me getting that confused or sitting on those war room calls, I'm sure you've been there, they're lovely, especially when they're 3 a.m. on Saturday, right? Because
Yep.
that helps with burnout. And we're arguing with each other. It's like, no, it says 4. And you're like, no, it says 5. Let me share my
Yes.
screen with you. No, let me share my screen with you. And you both look at it, it takes another half hour to finally realize, oh, you pulled it from that version or that instance, and I pulled it from this instance. So the impact on mean time to repair is clear. It's bad enough when you have just a bunch of tools, but then when you have multiple instances of the same tool and people looking at them different ways, and then some using it on a day-to-day basis, some using it just sporadically. I mean, the damage that can have on business operations is just massive, and it's
Absolutely.
just, and again, it plays back into that underpinning thread. I mean, are you being strategic in how you're operating your organization?
All right.
Or are you just saying, hey, we need another tool because there's a gap in some data point, so let's throw another tool at it?
Yeah.
It's just a disaster.
I think MTTR is a really good one that lines up with the point you made about measurement, right? Like the data that you had was sophisticated modern organizations measure well what they're doing so that they can understand how they're doing and whether things are improving. And I believe that MTTR has unfortunately become a bit of a crutch, right? It's easy to talk about, and obviously the business cares about mean time to resolve, but if you dig in deeper, for example, it's oftentimes the piece that's static is relatively simple is once I know what I need to solve, I can roll back my deployment. I can add more infrastructure. But as you say, that piece, that investigation can be variable, but it's multi-dimensional.
Oh
We
yeah.
too often times think about single dimension, which is, oh, what's the amount of time it took to do that investigation? But it could be the more sophisticated organizations I work with, they think about how many engineers are involved, because it might have only taken me 15 minutes to resolve. But if it's going to maintain it at that 15 minutes because it meets my SLA, but last year I had 420 engineers involved in it, and that's not an exaggeration. Some of
You
these
know.
critical bridge calls involve that number of engineers.
Yep.
Can I reduce that? Can I get that down to 40?
Yep.
That's a reduction of 90%. 90% of the engineer time that we spent in the call no longer burned unnecessarily, and obviously that has all those flow-on effects on burnout and those pieces. But then there's, I think, another dimension you can go down into, which is oftentimes who specifically, because not every engineer is created the same.
Yep.
And oftentimes what I see a pattern of is, oh, we got it down so that we only needed, 5, 10, 15 engineers on the call to solve the problem. But the question is, who were they? It's like,
Yep.
well, what do you mean? It's like, is it the same engineers all the time? And are they the most expensive engineers?
Yep. Yep. And and I mean, I know we talked about the burnout, but I get it. It's like, Bob is awesome, but if Bob is the first one we call every Saturday morning at 2 a.m. when something goes wrong, Bob's going to leave.
Right.
And so you have to address that on the personnel side. Um, yeah, I what you were just describing, I talk about it in terms of, sort of search, research, and act, right? That search piece is just something happened somewhere, somehow, right? And if you're bringing in the 20 or 50 or 100 people in just to go kick it around until you figure out where you even need to research, that's where you're just burning so many cycles. You're wasting so much energy. If you can thin that down, and even with, I always tell people, sometimes if the tools can just tell you it's not here, it's not in our EMEA operations, it's not in our LATAM, it's just North America, instantly you should be able to reduce who needs to be on those calls,
Yep.
like by 50, 60%.
Mean time to innocence.
Yeah, exactly. So you haven't really pinpointed it is this, but you've clearly said it's not any of these other things. That in itself is huge and in a great step in the maturity path. Because I mean, I hear from organizations all the time that they're like, oh, well, we can't pinpoint it to this. I'm like, okay, I get it. That takes a certain level of maturity. Can you eliminate 60% of your environment? Well, yeah. Okay. Isn't that good? You know,
Absolutely.
and I think that's what has led, I think, to a much stronger adoption of tracing, right?
Yep.
I think that obviously the technology has advanced quite a bit, right? But I think with that in place, it's giving more confidence
Yep.
that, hey, I'm going to leave Sally off the call because when I quickly look at this trace, I'm pretty sure it's one of these four systems. And Sally's not part of it. Joey's not part of it. We're going to leave all of our EMEA folks out of it, that sort of thing. So I mean, again, I was a practitioner for multiple decades and stuff. The tracing has kind of come on the back end of it. We've been trying, frankly, to do this in real time. So I'm kind of excited to see the technology have advanced as much as it has. So let's drill down into that a little bit more. Because there are challenges with it. I hear all the time, it's like, oh my God, we put tracing in place in storage and this and that, and
Yep.
volumes of data. So what are you seeing out in the field with that?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point, and don't I want to make sure the audience doesn't feel like we're just talking doom and gloom. So
No, no.
tying back,
I'm excited about this stuff.
yeah,
It's like I am a little bit of a cynic, but I think I get paid to be, right?
right,
But no, it's not doom and gloom. I think the opportunities are amazing now,
yeah,
but you have to be smart about them.
right. And so tying it back onto the observability strategy side of things, it's like you have to make deliberate choices about distributed tracing, for example, and how am I going to know that I'm ready? Who do I have in-house who's going to be able to help me? What do I need from a partner? Do I not need a partner at all? I might have the most sophisticated engineers in the world, and so they feel very confident either building their own or using open source components to help assemble their own solution. But if I'm an organization that traditionally has been running monoliths and I only have a small number of teams who have significant experience with cloud native technologies and microservices, maybe I need to rationalize a little bit the difference between those two situations and make my decisions accordingly, or maybe change my timeline. So, for example, if I'm moving away from, say, a traditional APM vendor, and I want the value of distributed tracing because I'm not solving my problems. I'm not able to identify, for example, as you said, the EMEA region is not the one that's involved. And I think the distributed tracing is sort of that next step of things. Okay, what kind of tooling, what kind of outcomes? Because too often I see people who still think of distributed tracing from a sophistication standpoint as still that waterfall view of a trace.
Yeah.
And that's fine when you're doing a very small pilot, but when you have every engineer accessing this stuff, when you have the compartmentalization of microservices, so often you don't want to be looking at that waterfall. You want to be looking at intelligent output from thousands, hundreds of thousands of those traces, so you can have that immediate information that the alert goes off. And as you said, don't worry about EMEA. Don't worry about this particular region in my PaaS provider. Don't worry about this version of the application. Only worry about this stuff. And so, as you said, really constrains that view of things. And I think that's really what the value of tracing is it allows us to negate the complexity that we've added through microservices and all of these new architectures. So if you go in eyes open from that perspective and think about those high level objectives, think about the capabilities that you need. One of the things, maybe selfishly, as a vendor, is many organizations don't think about what they need first.
Yeah.
And it's fine as a vendor to go, oh, these are all the capabilities you need. Tick all these things off. Here's all the things that Chronosphere is great at. But ultimately, that's not going to serve you successfully, right? So that observability strategy, if you think about that, it's like, okay, where am I at? Am I an organization that is maybe a little older, doesn't have a lot of cloud native expertise in-house? That needs to inform your requirements. And that means that when you come to evaluate a product, you're going to have a much more robust understanding and consistency through the organization. And it's actually going to make for a much faster evaluation experience. Organizations that we engage with who have a clear idea of what they want and how they want to get there don't have that issue of, oh, I start a pilot for 4 weeks, it turns into 9 weeks, and then after the 9 weeks, I'm still actually not sure whether I want to move forward or not.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. I did a at our summit last year, the presentation that I delivered in our track was essentially that. It's working backwards. It's like, what outcomes are you trying to achieve?
Right.
Okay, we've got that. Based on those outcomes, what are the insights that you need to achieve those outcomes? And that's a pretty clean, you can see those threads through the environment. I need to see these, this pathway to get to those outcomes. In order to get there, what visibility do I need that I would then thin out to provide the insight to achieve the outcome? But what we tend to do is, hey, this thing can see everything. It's got visibility across my full enterprise. And I'm across Azure, AWS, GCP. I still have on-prem. I've got mainframe. I've got this. I've got that. It's like, oh, I've got 3 bazillion devices and stuff. And yeah, we moved our whole division over to microservices. So that's, spinning up a, 3 bazillion terabytes of data. Oh yeah, that's going to work, right? That's really going to work. And sadly, what it often comes down to is it's not even a recognition of, oh, we basically went verbose on everything because we didn't know what we wanted or not. It usually is because we go back to the original point, the cost. Like, oh, we're just ingesting too much data and we're storing it. It's like it's costing too much. Oh, so let me just try and figure out if I can put it in S3 or somewhere else. It's like, wait, hold it. You haven't addressed the problem. The problem is you're spinning up so much data using 1% of it, maybe.
Yes.
And like, if you're not comfortable with that, cut it down to 10%. Those are the discussions that sadly we're still working forward when we need to be working backwards. What are you trying to achieve? What do you need to get there? And that's, but it is frustrating because we just keep repeating these cycles. We really, really keep repeating these cycles, and that's partly what I was a little worried about with the OTel stuff too, to be honest with you, the adoption of OTel. I saw the value in it. I've been around long enough. You can see by my lack of hair, I've pulled it all out in these years. I spent a lot of years in configuration management at CMDB, so you can tell. I had a lot of abuse in my childhood. So I've seen some of these frameworks and these models and these industry approaches, come and go. And my concern, and there still is some concern, is that I like it. I see the value in it. In theory, of course, it's perfect. I'm an electrical engineer. Of course, I want to modularize and really knock things out. But where are we going with that? The adoption is great. Are we going to be able to stick with it, or are we going to start getting variants of like, oh, I made this little tweak to the stock open telemetry framework for a little more performance, or for this extra bit of data, or this whatever. So I'm concerned about the adoption of OTel for that reason, or the abandonment maybe of it for that reason. I'm not sure if you've seen that too much, because it is also enabling organizations to, again, spin up tons of data that they don't necessarily need, and that sort of thing, because they're not, I don't believe, fully trained in the power of it. And again, working backwards, like, hey, it can do everything for me, so let's throw it in there and let's go.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different dangers with open telemetry, but I'm very excited about it. I think, though, that we just have to take a measured approach where, for example, if you're coming from an APM vendor and you're expecting parity, it's like, well, you need to have that clarity of what that parity looks like in your head, and be prepared potentially to figure out where you get that parity, and then like, okay, my cloud native applications to get the visibility I need. Is OpenTelemetry going to work necessarily my older monoliths? Maybe, maybe not. But that's, again, part of that evaluation framework, and understanding what your desired outcomes are, and then being realistic about that timeline. Do an investigation, measure, determine where you're at, and then be realistic. Like, maybe we can't use that here. Maybe we do have to, unfortunately, have a bit of a hybrid environment where we keep our legacy vendor for the legacy footprint, and we, gradually move forward and more of the newer footprint. Then also there's, I think, still a lot of potential with OpenTelemetry because it's many things, right? It's a format, it's an implementation, it's a way of managing some of this telemetry in your environment. And so again, digging deeper and going, well, what do I want from OpenTelemetry? Do I want a great out-of-the-box instrumentation experience? Maybe OpenTelemetry itself as an implementation doesn't give me that. Maybe there's a vendor that helps me with that, or maybe another open source solution I should use in combination. Or maybe the most important thing is that I am getting vendor agnosticism.
Yep. Yeah.
That
Look,
may
I see it. I see it in the enterprise. I mean, it is being widely adopted in varying degrees. Some are like, hey, I think a little ambitious, but they're like, we're going to get rid of all of our vendors and we're going to go all open source and open telemetry. I'm like, okay, well, you may want to be careful with that. But there are very few organizations that I've spoken to in the last 12, 18 months that haven't, to some extent, looked at, we're going to use some pieces or all of open telemetry, maybe in one division or in a different area. So the adoption is huge. And again, I think it's great. I'm just hopeful that we don't, because we are on our own worst enemy, that we don't butcher it,
Yes.
too soon, because it's not because people are being mean about it or stuff. It's like, I want to squeeze this little extra out of it, and then when we have enough of those, then we fragment the community, like we've done with other things. So yeah, I think the adoption is, like I said, we're in March of 2024. January of 2023. Definitely, late 2022, I wasn't totally convinced that it was going to stick. But I definitely retract that mental image that I have of it.
Sure.
So OTel, okay, we got the metrics, we got the distributed tracing. We talked about the MTTR and stuff. But I mean, ultimately, all these organizations, right? They're not greenfields. It'd be lovely. I was an enterprise architect. It would be beautiful to kind of put that in place, right? But everybody is in a transitory state, and they're migrating in some way, shape, or fashion, right? And that's a huge challenge for organizations. We've got 17 tools already. We talked about that earlier. We have a gap here. So do we just go get another tool? Or do we clean up our house first?
Right.
And it's tricky, right? Because I mean, I spent a lot of years in consulting, so I always say, well, it depends.
Yes.
But I think the answer is actually partly really simple on not how to get it done, but what you need to do. And it's like, what's your objective? We're back to the outcomes. What are you really trying to resolve? Are those gaps that you have in your coverage hampering your business from growing or from achieving its goals? Or are those gaps maybe in systems that aren't high critical? And maybe that's not your big thing. So maybe you do clean up your house first.
Right.
If it's one of your really critical systems, well, then there's no question, right? You need to fill that gap. So I think it's you just have to be cautious, but I think this also plays into ultimately, how do you go about this? We can't keep doing these point solutions or point answers. We have to have a more strategic view and a bigger vision on what do we want to be when we grow up.
Sure.
And that's really a big part, I think, in how do we migrate to this more observable environment.
Yeah, I think migration, regardless of how many tools you have, how many tools you're going to, what your objectives are, migration is the epitome of the observability strategy, sort of like apex point, right? Because it's incredibly unlikely that whatever product or technology you buy is going to drastically solve your migration problem, because that's not the role typically of a vendor. The vendor is selling you on their features and their capabilities, and that's where all their investment is going to go. Obviously, there are going to be sort of soft parts of that engagement, like the partnership piece that's important. But there really has to be an onus internally on the organization to, one, understand what are the resources we can bring to bear to a migration, and be realistic that there is always going to be pain. How much pain can the organization bear? And to your point, is that is it pain of, well, the pain of not having visibility is greater than the pain of migrating, but you essentially have to be able to quantify that. I've seen very sophisticated organizations quantify it in just raw dollar terms. The fact that we don't have this visibility is costing us this much every year. The disruption to our engineers to move tooling, it's going to cost us this much per engineer, multiplied by the number of engineers. Well, once these things weigh out in the positive, okay, we're going to go and take the hit on migration and get that return on investment. And ultimately, again, it's not something that it's not tracing, it's not metrics, it's not logs, it's not in the product tool. Maybe if you have a great potential partner, they'll be able to sit down and walk you through this mental framework. But the insight is really going to come from inside the house, and the decision has to come from within the organization when they think about this observability from a strategic perspective.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And we, we see this a lot with, especially like with automation and certain other technologies, right? Getting to the bad end faster is not a good thing, right? So just putting a new technology in place that's supposed to be great, but if you don't have good mechanisms, your processes aren't there, your notifications, your routing, your communications internally. I don't care what tool it is, unless you're a two-person shop, right? It's not going to make much of a difference. If anything, it could potentially make it even worse, right? So it's really, it's really important for people to understand that, like, you mentioned the term earlier, silver bullet. Yeah, I think we've all used that on many occasions. I always joke, the silver bullet usually only kills the person, firing the gun, So it's, we can't continue down that path, So, but I think part of the problem is, how do organizations select tools, that are going to get them those results? Is it based on the experience of the engineers? Are they experienced with these tools? Are they less familiar with these tools? So how do we, as an organization, if I'm, back to my old role as director of IT, getting there, I think, is a challenge. How do I pick this tool that, we talked about 400 engineers? Well, guess what? They have very different experiences, different skill sets. So let's think about that for a little bit. Like, what tools are going to be there? What features and functions are going to be there to help us, make those decisions?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to how much insight can you gain with as little effort as possible, right? So we have all of this data. We've talked a lot about sort of the giant explosion of data. If my entry point is an empty command bar with a query language that has 1,500 functions, that might be great for the Bobs of the world. I have 3 of those in my 1,500 engineer organization, but I'm bottlenecked on them, and I need everyone else, the 1,497 other engineers, to be productive. Okay, how much insight can they sort of push that to me? So it's understanding very much where your engineers are, and then also understanding the audience, and then going and looking at those tools. Like, okay, maybe I have 2 or 3 different key audiences in my engineering group. How effective are they going to be? Can I take the data from my OpenTelemetry instrumentation and use it in this tool from an evaluation standpoint and get to an answer faster than with my previous solution? And that's where you start to get into like very specific evaluation criteria, but that's all driven by the fact that, hey, I want MTTR. I want MTTR better, but I also understand what my people and my current processes and how those need to be improved. And so I have very specific ways of drilling in and evaluating. And sometimes this can even be done completely in that initial demo.
Yep.
I can't see my engineers ever using this. It's too sophisticated. I can't see my most sophisticated engineers using this because it just doesn't give them the depth they need. Maybe I need that Goldilocks moment for me.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, and this is actually one of the questions that just came in around that. to your point, you have engineers across the spectrum, some super, sophisticated, they know exactly what they're looking at. And you get more junior ones that they kind of have an idea where they're trying to go,
Yep.
and that's where it's tricky, I mean, in my role, I mean, I push yourself and the vendors to really put in place the ability for these tools to acknowledge that you're presenting around the right information in the right context to that persona that's using it at that moment in time, right? Because that's really the key. Like again, a more mature senior engineer, they're like, look, I know it's these 4 data points. That's what I'm looking for. I've just seen this a million times. That's what I know what I need to get to. If I'm more junior, I need to have it maybe presented in context of here's what's going on, here's the background, here's the supporting information, that sort of thing, because then that person changes. So
Yep.
you can't say like, oh, go to this one tool when you're a junior
Mm.
and this other tool when you're more senior. It just doesn't work that way.
I think
And
the really interesting area, and this is something we're investing in, is how can you take what's in the head of the experienced engineer and use that to influence things for the junior engineer? And
yeah,
there's always going to be tribal knowledge, right? Everyone has a
sure.
hope of automation and maybe even, the 2-letter word AI as magically solving everything. But all too often, it's like, well, we actually have the knowledge we need. It's just in a couple of people's heads. And we try to solve this with things like runbooks. But if we can go and take that tribal knowledge or institutional knowledge, and the verb I like to use is industrialize, if you can industrialize it in your tooling so that it just manifests as someone clicks through, it's like, well, here in this situation, we want to go from A to B to E, so that someone doesn't get lost in C and D, because that's the right way to solve it. And this is the way Bob understands it. Then everyone should know that. Lisa, Jenny, Paul, they should all be able to take advantage of that rather than call Bob up and go, what do I do? I'm lost in C.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and definitely for a different conversation, at another time. But the the fact that we're moving in this direction, that AI automation is doing so much more that we used to rely on a lot of the entry level folks that would grow. This was part of their maturing and growth within an organization, that they would get to tier 1 support, tier 2 support after a period of time because they saw so much. And that's a danger that enterprises need to think about when we go forward. We're automating away a lot of this mundane, repetitive stuff, which we should. But how do we capture that? Because at some point in time, the system's going to be down or inaccessible or whatever. And what do we do? We can't go ask Bob, because Bob is, it's Vicky from iRobot, right? And
Yep.
maybe she doesn't want to answer us, So we have to really think through that. But along that line, there's always, and this is a question that just came in, besides OTel, what other emerging technologies are basically shaping the landscape for observability? What do we see coming? So that's a question that just came in on the chat.
Yeah, I think there are two things, well, two themes, I would say. One, and we've talked about this before, is like you have giant explosion of data just because of what we've done. So technologies around refining that data, making sure that we keep the things that are valuable, but eliminating the cruft. That may be, hey, we can go and drop logs that are just info, and very basic things like that. Or in the case of tracing, which has the potential to have way more data volume than even logging, unfortunately, it may be a case of, can we only keep the errors? Can we keep the things for our most important customers, and those kinds of areas? But ultimately, it's a form of control. And this may not be a case of, oh, we just discard everything, but maybe we route data to places that make sense for it. So logging is a great example where most organizations use logging for at least two different reasons. They use it for real-time observability use cases, and they use it for security use cases. And obviously there are vendors that cater to both, but a lot of organizations pick two different or four different solutions for those two different use cases. So being able to route that data and not just say, okay, all the logs go to my SIEM tool, all the logs go to my observability tool. Oh wait, I have two of each. Now I'm paying for it 4 times. But then there's oftentimes a third use case, which is compliance, which is completely different. And it's the usage pattern of it and the cost benefit of it is completely different. So I see a lot of control being exerted, or an intention to exert control from customers, wanting to say, I want the really specific security logs to go to my SIM tool. And I want that to be less than 5% of my total log volume. I want my real-time logs for observability to go to my observability tool. And I want that to be less than 15% of my logs. But for compliance reasons, I need to go stick 100% of everything somewhere that's really cold and cheap.
Yep.
And so that leads to the rise of telemetry pipelines as well. So, there's, I would say, control capabilities around cost management, but then more specifically, telemetry pipelines are two things that are really big shifts right now. And these are driven by these outcomes that particularly the forward thinkers from a observability strategy perspective are pushing vendors like us to be able to deliver.
Yeah, and that's what I'm, along with that, I was seeing, because a lot of them want to, whether or not, they truly go there or when they go there, they say, oh, we want to be proactive, we want to be predictive and stuff. Like, well, do you have the data? Do you have the granularity of data? Do you have the depth and breadth of data to do that? You want to be data driven? Absolutely, I agree. But do you have what you need, where you need it, when you need it to actually do that analytic, to do that processing to get you there? And you have to be smart about it because, like you said, I mean, it's actually an issue that I've had several discussions with some colleagues of mine about, the complementary sides of the SIM and the observation AI ops space, right? It's like looks like a lot of the same data because to the point that we made a bit ago is I don't know what I want, so I'm going to throw it all in there. So now you have it all in there on both sides of the fence. And let's be honest, the security implications and vulnerability implications are huge because now you have sensitive information in two locations, not just one. And one of the sides doesn't really understand that it's maybe secure type stuff. But that one we could probably spend way too much time on. One last question before we kind of wrap up. This just came in, so let me read it here. What specifically should businesses consider to be ready for an observability tool migration?
I think, as we talked about before, being very clear and getting about what are you trading off and getting the organization bought in. Because ultimately, for example, you might be doing this from a raw business perspective, the economics. We have to shift observability tooling because there are famous cases, obviously, where we're spending 8 figures on observability and it's growing at a rate that's faster than our revenue. It's faster than our spend on infrastructure. So that may be a business decision, but the individual engineer who might have a high degree of comfort with the current tooling may not understand that, may not comprehend that, and sees their cheese being moved, where the tool that I rely on to do my work is suddenly being changed, and maybe I haven't felt like I had a voice in that. So I think there's a big part in making sure that all the stakeholders across the organization, high or low in the org chart, understand what's going on, and then feedback needs to be taken. So if there's going to be a trade-off, how is it going to be mitigated? The negative's going to be mitigated for the engineer who maybe doesn't see any real benefit from a cost perspective because they're not the CFO, but what can they experience? And I think realistically, it's asking the questions, what can we do to mitigate this? Do we have to take it all on ourselves? Or are there particular experts in the organization? Is there automation? Is there something the vendor can bring? For some of these larger enterprises, it's very common to have a services partner. They may not be directly interfacing with your observability, but they're touching other pieces of your technology stack. Can they come in and do some of those things to make sure that the migration is as seamless as possible? But again, it really feeds back into, are we taking a strategic approach on this, or are we just sort of hip firing and trying to duck and weave through these circumstances without holistically looking at the outcomes that we want and how best to achieve those?
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'll kind of wrap up on this and then hand over to Ava. So much of this comes back to leadership and under that, the organizational structure that they put in place. If folks feel threatened that it's going to take their jobs, it's going to put their job in jeopardy because it's doing this and it's doing that, or it's going to expose them. That's such a huge issue that the technology could do this and this, but if the leadership isn't there communicating what we're doing, why we have to do it, what are the implications of that, and the organization that they've built under them around it isn't there supporting it, it's such a major factor there that doesn't, in my opinion, get really spoken to enough, because the tool can do it, but if the people aren't ready, if the leadership isn't trusted, and look, I mean, and I know we kind of said that was kind of last one, but that plays into the the costs, the movement forward. There's just so much that that is reliant on the people side of this, like like you said, and because the people side are the ones that are driving the strategy, that are driving the communication, that are really going to settle the playing field for that organization to move forward. And if
Yep.
they're not comfortable with it, it's really going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I see one last point came through.
Okay.
So someone was talking about their observability cost scaling, even though they have a centralized tooling for this, and the ask has been made of them to talk to their developers, reduce logging, APM data, and there's a concern from this person that it doesn't feel like the right approach. And this sort of ties back to what we talked about in terms of emerging technologies. If the tooling itself isn't allowing you to manage these costs and understand where the value of the data is, then maybe that's a trigger for you as an organization. From a strategic perspective, the tooling that we have is not solving the problem that we need to be solving. And instead, it's just causing a lot of internal friction. So I'd definitely say, and I'm happy to follow up in a conversation with this person, but that may be a point where the tooling is failing you and it's not aligned with your observability strategic objectives.
Ava, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. And Carlos and Ian, thank you both so much for sharing your insights and expertise. As I mentioned, we will be sending out a recording of this session, as well as some additional resources. Carlos, if you can switch to the next slide, for you to check out. If you have any questions or would like to have a deeper conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. Ava, bye.